Okay. So let me welcome you once more. I see there are a few more people joining us. A very warm welcome to everyone. We would have loved to meet in person on this occasion, but we will have to stick to the virtual meeting and a virtual celebration. If we look at the bright side, then we could say more people can join us today than they would have been able to had we met in person. But there are some pluses and some minuses that come with it, obviously. We have very good reasons to celebrate today. And sometimes when we finish projects, we never really give ourselves the chance to properly celebrate what we have achieved. We want to take this opportunity today to say thank you to everyone who has participated in this, and cheers and well done, because we've come to the end of a process that started a bit more than a year ago. About a year ago, we received submissions to the annual symposium of GigaNet. And at that point, we were also in touch with the Telecommunications Policy Journal to discuss the possibility of doing a special issue. Somehow, to our satisfaction, everything came together very nicely, even in times of high uncertainty. And we are really pleased to see that we were able to work together on this project without any additional hassles, which rarely ever happens. As you know, you start a project, but then everything has to be reconsidered. In this case, we could go ahead with the initial idea without any changes. We received many high quality contributions for the GigaNet Symposium, and a large part of them were naturally clustering around the theme of norm entrepreneurship. Therefore, our job was relatively easy. An editorial team of 4 coordinated the work of a group of 12 dedicated scholars, and I'm happy to say that we have all of the authors here today with us to talk about their cutting-edge research. Special thanks to those who connect at less convenient hours in their time zones, and also during national holidays. So again, a very big gratitude for everyone being present today. The results of this year-long journey are really impressive, and they are worth celebration. We have a collection of 9 original research articles plus an editorial published in about half a year in a top journal in our field. The timeliness of this special issue cannot be sufficiently underscored. All articles have very strong policy implications and a huge potential to contribute to ongoing policy debates around platform governance, the regulation of fake news and artificial intelligence, as well as on the role of the technical community and of civil society in designing and implementing norms. The editorial team included Matthias Kettemann, Trisha Meyer, Jamal Shahin, and myself as special issue editors, and Eric Bolin, the editor-in-chief of Telecommunications Policy, who has been extremely supportive along the way. You will hear from both Eric and Jamal shortly. We will then give the floor to the authors to talk about their research and to provide an overview of the topics that they addressed. And we'll leave around the 30 minutes at the end for a general discussion and I hope a fruitful exchange of ideas. If I can quickly turn to Eric, I'd like to invite him to reflect on the experience and on this collaboration as the editor-in-chief of Telecommunications Policy. Eric, please, you have the floor.
Okay, well, thank you. I just wanted to say also how very glad I am for this collaboration and look forward to more collaborations. And just to say a few words about the journal and the context of the journal and the context of special issues. So first of all, if you look closely at my image on the top, it says volume 45 of Telecommunications Policy. So it's been around, and it's it's an image of this current cover for this special issue. So it's been around for a considerable time. And the journal, as the name denotes, it started really with the core telecommunications liberalization, deregulation policy concern in the late 1970s. And also there were communities of groupings that started to work together, say the Telecommunications Policy Research Conference, TPRC, in the United States. The International Telecommunications Society was formed in the early 1980s, and other Pacific Telecommunications Council was formed also in the late 1970s. And all of them have, over the years, contributed with special issues. And special issues are really useful to especially highlight a research agenda, highlight new things on the scene, which needs to be sort of shepherded, taken care of. Sometimes, of course, special issues represent a kind of a proceedings, and it's really the better if they are in the thematic way. But we had not so many these kind of collaborations with the internet community, you could say. And so this forum and our special issue is really good for the journal. Of course, these communities that I mentioned before, TPRC, that acronym is still around, but they call themselves Internet Conference now, even though it's TPRC. And all others are, of course, since many years, addressing internet policy and information policy. But still, there are considerable inertias in different communities and in different journals, because there is a kind of a lock-in between reviewers, authors, and topics. So therefore, renewing both societies and journals is a really long-term process. And I'm glad to say, in terms of the journal, that we have a really good standing in terms of, say, impact factor citations. We are Q1 in all our 6 Scopus categories. So we are doing very well. But this collaboration together with you, even though we published a lot of similar papers before, represents something which I welcome very much. And to deal and to think about internet evolution, not just from policy, but social aspects, user aspects, and of course, technology as a fundamental driver. So it's with a great pleasure that I welcomed and started to work with Roxana and others, and also just the title Norm Entrepreneurship, which you could say has connections with debates in SDS communities and other places, this norm innovation concept. So anyway, this special issue brings a lot of new things for the journal, and I'm expect it will be much recognized and well cited, and would like to congratulate you for this excellent collaboration. And as Roxana mentioned, it went very well. The process was very smooth, and thankfully the papers were very good as well. So thank you for this, Roxana and all others. And I look forward to listen to your presentations and also take more questions and comments later on. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks also for the kind words and for your support all throughout the process. And I hope and I look forward to continuing working with telecommunications policy in the future. We'd also like to hear a few words from a member of the editorial team. So I'll give the floor to Jamal to talk about the experience of putting together the special issue from the perspective of the editors, and also about the novelty of our work here. Jamal?
Yeah, thanks, Roxana. I hope everybody can hear me fine. For some reason, my microphone decided a couple of days ago to start crackling at some point, so probably at very key points in the talk. But it's good to see so many authors in the same Zoom room. I'll explain a bit the process that we went through. I mean, you're all familiar with parts of the process, I guess. you know, it's nice to see everybody together. Now you can compare the reactions you had from the different editors in the team, but maybe I'll just follow on from what Eric was saying. Thank you very much for the intro. And kind of lead into how this smooth process actually took place, because you know, as Roxana mentioned at the beginning, these were all papers that were submitted first and foremost to the GigaNet Symposium in 2020, which took place in that rather strange Zoom land. However, that the process of going through those papers at the symposium also allowed us to kind of bring together or recognize some of the themes and the thematics that were being touched upon in many of the papers and bring them together in the special issue under the title of Norm Entrepreneurship. Which has proved, as Eric has said, to be something that crosses across divides and looks or introduces different approaches to understanding some of the topics that are being raised in internet governance at the moment. The collaboration, I hope all of the authors will agree with us. I think from the editorial side, I can say thank you very much to all the authors for delivering drafts and responding to comments so positively and enthusiastically. I think it went particularly exceptionally well. I don't know whether that's a consequence of being stuck in your offices and not being able to travel around, but definitely the timeliness and the response from each of the authors was very much appreciated, and the willingness to actually adapt in very few cases the theme and ensure that the theme was emphasized in your work was very useful. How it all went after the symposium, we selected some of the papers. You'd already had feedback from the symposium. I'd like to thank very much the discussants who took part in the symposium and provided their feedback to the specific papers, as well as the audience in the rooms that actually reacted to the papers as they were presented. We then divided the tasks among the four of us and edited very lightly, in some cases, the papers, trying to ensure that there was this coherent story that was told. And as I said before, you were all very enthusiastic in actually working with us, working with the whole team to ensure that that came through. I mean, the theme itself is quite novel, I think, in this sphere. Eric mentioned that this is something that, you know, now we're trying to bring forward. The editorial team in itself, I think, was quite a diverse group. I hesitate to give labels to us because I don't think they count for much, but, you know, amongst our backgrounds in the team, you can see communications policy, media law, international relations, political science, and so on. So you can see these different kinds of attributes that played out, or these different kinds of influences that come in and make us see the broader picture of norm entrepreneurship. And I think we were able to use that as a team to also kind of extract these different approaches that many of you had contributed as authors to the special issue. I'd really like, though, to thank Roxana for being the motor behind a lot of the activities, organizing the GigaNet Symposium, liaising not only with the IGF people, but also with Eric at Telecommunications Policy for ensuring that this whole thing went very smoothly. So a round of applause for Roxana. We'll do that later. But thank you very much for that. Amongst also the authors that we have on my screen in front of me, we see quite a diverse group coming not only from different disciplines, but also from different levels. Some of you are, well, we're all very young, right? But some of us are younger scholars than others. And that's something that I think we should be very proud of, bringing together these different approaches, bringing together these different researchers at different stages in their career as well. I think geographical diversity is something that most academic disciplines or most academic conferences and special issues may suffer from, and that's something that we might want to address in the future. But we did try on the diversity front to ensure that there was also a range of different experiences brought in. You brought in your own nuances to the debates as well. We were able to pick up on different strands of things that came out from different of the articles. So different articles focused on slightly different things, and some focused on very much more specific to policy areas, some focused more on the norms, ideas, and some focused on industrial actors, some focused on different types of actors, and that we managed to bring all of that in together. And I think that one of the nice things that we were able to do was really bring this idea of norm entrepreneurship to the fore, and we gave it specifically a nice label, norm fair. And within that, we hope that this will turn out to be a label to define a research agenda that helps kind of frame these interactions between the different actors and the different norms that they support or aim to discredit in this sphere of internet governance in the future. So, I mean, you know, I think there's quite a lot of novelty that emerged from bringing all of these different researchers, different papers, different themes together, and also contributing to a broader debate on norms and norm entrepreneurship, and hopefully, you know, allowing for us to move forward under this new label of norm fair, to which we would like to launch the debate. So there we go, Roxana, that's from my side, the novelty of the special
Thank
issue.
you, Jamal. And let me just say thank you once more to everybody who was on the editorial team, to Matthias, who is here with us today, to Jamal, who just spoke about the whole process, and to Trisha, who unfortunately couldn't join us today, but has been actively involved in the editorial process. So thank you to everyone for making this possible. And now we'll actually give another round of thanks to the authors, but only after we hear about the research they have presented in their articles. So we'll start in the order that is also the publication order. So we'll start with Nanette, and she'll give us an overview of idea entrepreneurs. Nanette, over to you.
Thank you very much, Roxana. I'd like to especially thank the editor-in-chief and the terrific team of 4, our series editors, who truly have been inspirational and innovative thought leaders. With that, I'm just going to say a few words about the research that I reported on in this article. I actually grappled with 2 related research puzzles, and they actually relate to an early stage of norm fair. That is the stage that I call idea entrepreneurship, prior to a segment of an idea becoming or not becoming a norm. And I did this against the backdrop of an online as opposed to a face-to-face setting due to the pandemic and their advantages and disadvantages. In a nutshell, I wanted to track the idea flow at a new entity at the United Nations, the Open-Ended Working Group related to cybersecurity, otherwise shortly named the OEWG. It existed from 2019 until 2021, and my article takes it up to the point January 2021, when it was just about to finalize its official final report, which ultimately was done on March 28th, but obviously after the article was finished. In that, I've been very interested most of my career, not only in the development of the research on norms, not just in international relations, but in our cyber field, but also on digital divides. And so what I wanted to do was to look at idea entrepreneurs, especially non-state actors, as well as nation-state actors, and focus on ideas related to gender, human rights, and development. And a sub-question related is, what was the role of those non-state actors? Did they have any role at the OEWG? Because in the cybersecurity arena at the UN, before this OEWG, there was no formal role for non-state actors. So what did I find? I'm just going to highlight a couple of findings. The first finding was interesting and very straightforward. The OEWG, for the first time, actually held consultations with and published submissions from non-state actor organizations. However, little footnote, they needed to be accredited in the UN system. More about that in the article. A more interesting finding to me was what I identified as a galaxy of ideas related to digital divides. And what I meant by this, borrowing from colleagues in the human rights and international business arena, was to look to see if one idea was mentioned in content analysis, if another one followed nearby. And again, I looked at the categories of the ones I'm reporting here: gender, human rights, and sustainable development. And what I found was fascinating. There was a direct correlation with geopolitics, power, and national culture, and their views on the role of non-state actors as idea entrepreneurs. And just a quick footnote, one can just imagine, for example, Russia and China at the beginning of the OEWG process saying that these ideas belonged elsewhere at the United Nations, they were being handled elsewhere, they should not appear in the OEWG's work. Yet there was strong support from other governments. And I looked to see, and I actually found that those ideas became palatable even at the time that I stopped this article on telecommunications policy and afterwards, in terms of a linkage to an idea that was actually accepted almost universally. And that idea, that vocabulary, is the term capacity building. So where those words do appear together, they appear linked to capacity building, and often with an adjective appropriate that many of us know from the original definition of internet governance, the appropriate roles for non-state actors. Two concluding thoughts. One of the things that truly fascinated me and I continue to work on is the opportunity to identify and study, as I hope many of you will, other galaxies of ideas, not just in our own internet governance ecosystem, but in similar global governance systems, such as global health and also the environmental arena. And the closing implication comes from colleagues who actually work in another global governance arena, the environmental arena. And in 2020, they wrote something that actually stays in my mind, and I hope will inspire all of us to continue our work. And they say, struggles to frame norms never end, nor are they truly consistent across groups and times. It's a challenge to all of us to continue to study and to think about the variables that shape that lack of or presence of consistency. And with that, I'll turn it back to our moderator.
Thank you so much, Nanette. And with the UN picture in mind, we'll now shift a little bit our understanding of the dynamics of norm contestation to the technical community. So we'll give the floor to Corinne, who has been a fine observer of the human rights advocacy in the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force. She has been studying them for many years now. So over to you, Corinne.
Let me just move into a room with a slightly less disturbing background light. Perfect. Thank you so much for organizing this and for inviting us. So my name is Corinne Kath. I'm an anthropologist of internet infrastructure politics, which essentially means that I study internet governance through ethnographic methods. So participant observation, interviews with internet architects and their norm entrepreneurs. And for this particular paper, which is entitled The Technology We Choose to Create, Human Rights Advocacy in the Internet Engineering Task Force, I draw from my PhD research, which I recently finished, which included 3 years of participant observation in the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is one of the internet's key standardization bodies. And in particular, I followed a group of advocates and activists who attempted to include human rights norms in technical standards. And in this paper, I outline how and why their efforts were largely dismissed by many IETF engineers. I specifically show that the dismissal of human rights is not so much rooted in a problem of technical infeasibility, but that it stems more from the internet's particular view of technology and its culture of laissez-faire technology development. And in particular, I show that the IETF is driven by what I term protocol non-prescriptiveness, which I explain as a culturally shared view of standards as rooted in liberal notions of freedom and autonomy, in which the IETF cannot and should not prescribe to others how standards are used, or whether they should be built in a way to include particular human rights outcomes. And what I argue is that this particular non-prescriptive view explains the IETF's engineers' limited focus, or their focus on a limited number of liberal values, and their dismissal of the human rights norms. And I believe that these findings about the nature of IETF culture matter, because what we tend to see in a lot of internet governance literature is that the IETF is described in very positive terms. It is often lauded in its role as a protector of the open internet. And what I really try to do is question some of these more positive descriptions through my consideration of IETF culture from the ground up. And what I hope that this paper does is really start a critical conversation about the values and norms driving internet governance, as well as encouraging other academics to critically question some of the taken for granted truths about the political nature of protocols and the governance standards set by organizations like the IETF. Because what I do find is that this non-prescriptive view of technology renders the IETF and similar organizations incapable of addressing really urgent issues around rights and justice and equity that arise from the way that they perform internet governance. And with that, I'll give the floor back to Roxana.
Thank you very much. And also thank you for sticking to the time allocated to the presentations. We'll have another take on how the technical community reacted to norm changes from Julien. Also, thank you, Julien, for joining us on a national holiday. Tell us a bit more about your research.
Yeah, thank you very much, Roxana. Thank you to all of the editors and to Eric Bolin for this great special issue on norm entrepreneurship. So my research comes from, I'm going to share my screen. Not sure my presentation is going to add much, but my research came from the standpoint of data protection and privacy scholarship, and from a political science perspective. And I became interested in the development of what Deirdre Milligan and Nick Doty have called techno-policy standard setting. In the case of my research, it was, of course, centered on privacy. I studied the two working groups of the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, the Tracking Protection Working Group, and the Privacy Interest Group, which are two groups within W3C that have slightly different methods on how to include privacy protections in standards, but are both focused on that aim. And in the course of studying these fora, where I was looking at the structure of the arguments exchanged by privacy advocates and other participants that may not have the same sensitivity to this topic, I was puzzled by the relationship between law, legal instruments, and standards. On the one hand, many interviewed participants to these groups stated that they viewed their work as being at least at arm's length from the law, and explained that they did not really look at the law as being a source of norms or as their standards as implementing laws. But at the same time, many participants were using arguments based on the law, especially US and European law on privacy and data protection, to advance their own normative vision of what standards should be. And to a certain point, at least when we look, for example, at the work done by the Tracking Protection Working Group, we had outcomes that did take into account a certain number of things that came from the law, and among other things, for example, the definition of this notion of personal data that came directly from European law. The question that it explored by the article is whether and to what extent we could say that internet standard setting, at least in the field of privacy, has managed to secede from what John Perry Barlow called those various giants of steel and flesh and steel. And the findings are actually quite limited, because in one way we can see that norm entrepreneurs from the privacy advocate side are using legal arguments to further their aims, because they can present something that is fundamentally political as being merely technical. It's about complying to the law. It's not about protecting human rights, for example. But at the same time, what we see is that although some documents are written that contain provisions that seem inspired by the law, those are not necessarily implemented, and there is a lot of competition between different standards. And finally, there is no clear relationship that could be described in the way of the hierarchy of norms that is familiar to legal scholars in the field of standards, even in the field of privacy techno-policy standards. So I'll keep it at that to keep it short. Yeah, so these are the main findings. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And that gives us a nice segue into the legal side of things. And we'll go to Robert, who provided an in-depth analysis of NetzDG, Germany's controversial law.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks so much to Roxana and to all the editors for organizing this. It's great to be here. I'm Robert Gorwa. This paper is another NetzDG paper, but it's a case study from my PhD thesis, which is looking at platform regulation in a comparative perspective globally. So I'm a political scientist with a background in kind of interdisciplinary internet studies stuff. And that's kind of the perspective I brought to view on this paper. So I guess the kind of top line motivation, which came out of just a broader interest in hearing tons about all these different things, which I call platform regulation in a very narrow sense. So specifically laws that are setting rules around how major user generated content platforms govern their services in terms of content. So the types of standards that start delineating things like, how company reporting mechanisms work around content, how kinds of transparency reporting requirements are met or not met, et cetera, et cetera. And the NetzDG is, of course, of interest as a kind of emblematic case, a very famous and controversial one, as Roxana said, and also arguably maybe the first global law that very specifically outside of a realm like copyright, intellectual property is looking at harmful content and how companies set standards. And it was born, I guess, out of an observation that while there was lots of great work by legal scholars, especially, who have been kind of leading the way in analyzing these laws and their ramifications and implications, and of course, folks like Matthias have been doing wonderful work on this, putting my kind of public policy scholar hat on, I was really interested that there's been a lot less work kind of looking at the politics behind the scenes and the reasons why these kinds of things emerge and why the specific provisions of them are the way they are, et cetera, et cetera. So the method of this case study, basically, like I mentioned, it's one out of multiple case studies in my thesis, was to combine various qualitative methods. So I conducted about 30 interviews with what I call governance stakeholders in government, in civil society, all the major platforms that were involved in these debates, which were basically Facebook, Google, and Twitter. And I also used freedom of information access requests to both various German government departments as well as to the European Commission. I'll talk in a second, but one of the things that I was really interested in was the way that this process was kind of shaped by the institutional constraints of the European Commission and basically its regulatory harmonization procedures. So yeah, those were the two methods. And just very, very briefly, again, if anyone's interested in this, please check out the article. But I was looking at the origins of this law actually a bit earlier than a lot of people look. So this kind of voluntary mechanism that was called the task force that was started in 2015. And the kind of core of my argument is basically that, you know, obviously this is an important law and policy framework, but there's a lot of politics here, and domestic and kind of transnational politics matter a lot. So I look a lot at these institutional factors. So I make this argument about this notification procedure having a pretty big role in terms of creating a veto point through which the EU could kind of exert pressure on Germany to adapt the law. Again, this is very wonky and very specific to the formulations here, but there was basically an interesting case where you had a lot of domestic demand driven by kind of domestic electoral factors, right? There was, the law ended up going through parliament on the last day before an election, and there was pressure within the German governing coalition, the SPD especially, to do something on hate speech due to other kind of political contextual reasons. But there are also kind of inherent tensions between this type of approach that the German government was very intent on doing and, you know, other EU intermediary liability frameworks that Matthias and others have written about. So I look a little bit through these FOIAs, which give kind of some back room, I guess, interesting policymaking documents, emails in between folks in Germany and the Commission trying to decide what they're going to do, you know, a big debate about whether or not they should basically write this detailed opinion. So, you know, if you're a member state, you can't just pass a law when you feel like it. It has to be notified to the Commission, and there's technically a kind of box ticking exercise through which it gets evaluated for applicability and compatibility with EU law. And the interesting thing in this case is that there was a lot of questions basically about whether this actually violated EU law or not. And a lot of experts say that it does in various ways, and those are very wonky. And we can maybe get into it in the Q&A, but it's just interesting to look at the kind of backroom political factors that played a role in this. So yeah, basically the conclusion here, and we can, you know, talk a little bit more about all this in the Q&A, but the conclusion, I guess, if I had to summarize it very simply, is that obviously, you know, platform regulation is still regulation, it's still politics, and there's a lot of kind of behind the scenes things at the domestic and transnational levels. So yeah, if you're interested in a case study on that, that maybe kind of looks a little bit behind the scenes, like I said, I'd check out the article. Yeah, so thanks again for having me, and thanks again to the editors for putting together this great special issue. It's a real honor.
Thank you, Robert. And from Germany, we heard quite a bit about the European Commission exchanges. We'll go to a case study of another European Commission work, let's say. We have the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence that Nicola looked at in great detail.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to Matthias, Roxana, Jamal, and Trisha for taking the initiatives for organizing this wonderful meeting. Well, my article investigates the role of epistemic community in creating a human rights framework for the digital space. And as you know, the digitalization has risen a lot of concern about the impact that it could have on society, especially related to issues such as surveillance, manipulation, freedom of expression. Not by chance, in the last few years, we witnessed to the flourishing of serious initiatives aiming to setting political rights, governance norm, and limitation on the exercise of the power in the internet. However, the effectiveness of these attempts to constitutionalize the cyberspace, even when formalized in law, is challenged by some features of the internet and the digital ecosystem. First of all, we know the digital processes are transnational, transborder in nature. This could create uncertainty about what kind of legislation and rules should be adopted. Then the most part of the operation on the internet is performed by private actors. And we know that, for example, international human rights law concern first of all the relationship between states and citizens. So they could have also a limited and direct effect on private actors. And then also we know that digital architectures are means of governance in themselves, meaning that they are able to regulate human behavior. And then to be effective, human rights standards need to be embedded within the infrastructural level. And then my hypothesis in this article was the epistemic community have the potential to overcome these difficulties. Indeed, epistemic communities are qualified by the sharing of validated knowledge, and the legitimacy of this kind of knowledge, especially in situation of uncertainty, could create a convergence of expectation around a common set of value, rules, and principles linked to some international standard. Then the member of epistemic community could come from and interact with different kind of stakeholder groups, so they have the potential to disseminate the normative framework between both state and non-state actors. And third, epistemic community have the necessary expertise and competencies to translate human rights standard into technical standard that could be embedded within the design of digital architectures. To understand how concretely epistemic community could reach this resource, I analyzed the work of the European Commission High-Level Expert Group on Artificial Intelligence. That was a particularly favorable case, I have to admit. And to analyze this case, I performed an affiliation network analysis, retracing previous shared education and professional experience of the member of this group. And then I performed also a discursive network analysis, retracing shared belief argumentation among them. And I found that effectively in the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence, we can find a subgroup of 30 people on 52 that could be defined as an epistemic community that shared previous experience, and above all, they share a common belief system according to which the full potential of artificial intelligence could be attained only aligning the design of artificial intelligence system to a set of principles and requirements derived from fundamental rights, including privacy, fairness, explainability, human oversight, and so on. They also believe that this requirement could be implemented through a series of technical, non-technical methods. And they also believe that the impact of artificial intelligence system and their compliance with the fundamental rights could be measured and monitored by the means of specific metrics and procedures. This belief system flowed in the main outputs of the high-level expert group, that is the ethical guideline for the trustworthy artificial intelligence. And then I found that this document effectively influenced both the European Union policy on artificial intelligence, including the recent proposal for an Artificial Intelligence Act, and it also influenced non-state stakeholders. We refer to this kind of guideline in the internal policies. Okay, so I leave the floor to the next speaker. Thank you very much for your attention, and we'll be happy to answer to any question you could have.
Thank you, Nicola. Great overview. With the next two papers, we'll look at a process that has been for a long time referred to as a novel process in the UN system, the Internet Governance Forum. So first, I'll give the floor to Chelsea to talk about her analysis of the fake news discussions, and then we'll hear from Nadia and Jamal on who makes up civil society at the IGF.
So much. And
Chelsea, we don't hear you very well.
how about now? Is this better? Excellent.
Yeah, much better, much better.
So thank you for that. And just want to say thank you to Roxana and the editorial team of the special issue. And thank you to Eric and the whole team at Telecommunications Policy. So my work is on at IGF, and my interest is on the post-truth era. So in 2016, the Oxford English Dictionary declared post-truth as the word of the year, and it has kind of gained a popularity since then. But what's most interesting about the post-truth era is this term of fake news. I use air quotes around that because, as many scholars agree, this has become a heavily politicized, overly expansively used term to refer to a lot of different things. And so that's a bit problematic when we approach the study of and the research of and policies of quote unquote fake news. So the purpose of my paper, the study that I did with my paper, was to shed the insights on the major themes and terms of discussion of fake news as in terms of rhetoric, but also as a phenomenon in relationship to internet governance. And I did this specifically at the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum. And so one of the major issues of internet governance today centers on this critical and urgent question of the regulation of fake news. And we have this issue of at what level, the local, the national, the international. So these are some of the issues that we're grappling with this phenomenon. So the paper largely addresses the question of like, what are we really talking about when we talk about fake news? So the overall data set and the methods, I was looking at IGF from the period of the post-truth era onwards. So from 2016 to 2019, which was the most recent information available at the time of the study. And it's, as we all know here, an ideal place for studying because it has representatives from over 161 countries. The transcripts, which are constituted the majority of the data set, are publicly available, and the full transcripts are available. I focus specifically on those panels and sessions that address with fake news topics. So this is just a bit of a sneak peek of some of the results. I conducted a term frequency analysis. What we're looking at here is the terms, key terms from 2016, which focused on rights, online, and journalists, as opposed to in 2019, this shift in the focus had changed rather drastically, and we see a focus on data and content, media and information. So we do see a marked change in the terminology being used to apply to fake news discussions and panels. And just to sum up some of the key findings, this paper studies the normative applications of fake news rhetorics, and it shows that they've evolved in this post-truth era. And specifically that these key terms have shifted indeed from 2016 to 2019. And interestingly, the term fake itself, from the term fake news, peaked in 2017 and 2018, but then disappeared. And so we don't see that language being used as much in these high-level conversations at IGF. Which is interesting because many scholars and researchers have argued for a while now that calling something fake news is problematic. And so we're seeing that argument is taking place and having an effect as we see that language shifting out of these conversations. And then lastly, as I mentioned, that the discussions have shifted from concerns of rights and journalists to that of data and content. So the focus of what fake news concerns are addressing have shifted, and what we're concerned about has changed. And as a last note here, it was very interesting to find that in 2019, we see much more specific language. So instead of fake news, which we know is this really a problematic term for many reasons, we see more focus on disinformation. So the more precise and specific language is starting to take form rather than the more popular fake news, but we see more precise language with disinformation appearing. So I look forward to questions in the discussion part afterwards, but I'll leave it there. So thank you so much.
Thank you. With our next paper by Nadine, Trisha, and Jamal, we'll look at the normal entrepreneurs in the IGF space.
Thank you very much, Roxana. And first of all, congratulations to everyone for all your hard work and your contributions. I'm very honored to have been considered, but also to be among all these different scholars where I'm just starting at the beginning of my journey. So hello and good afternoon from Bruges in Belgium. My apologies, my camera is not on. I don't know why. I just came from another Zoom meeting and it worked. But I hope that you don't mind. My name is Nadine Trisha, and I'm a PhD fellow at the United Nations University Institute for Comparative Regional Integration Studies and the Vrije Universiteit Brussel. And on behalf of Professor Trisha Meyer and Professor Jamal Shahin and myself, I'm pleased to present our paper, What is Civil Society and Who Represents Civil Society at the IGF? An analysis of civil society typologies in internet governance. So our work seeks to contribute to a bigger debate in which we as a society are trying to develop a new IGF structure which is inclusive and multi-stakeholder. However, currently civil society is treated rather ambiguously, both in the literature, but also in practice. So what we did is that we analyzed the on-site participation data sets of the IGF from 2006 to 2019 to understand the composition of participation of civil society. And we designed a framework and typology which aims to provide a better insight of representation of civil society at the IGF. So our exploratory study looked at the wide range of structures, norms, and roles emphasized for civil society. Although the different definitions of civil society treated as one homogeneous group, almost all definitions examined seem to recognize that this group consists of a large number of different actors that are diverse in structure, nature, and objective. And this ambiguity led us towards focusing on composition. And therefore we decided to focus on a purpose-focused approach, which for us is a necessary step that needed to be carried out in order to understand how to engage effectively, but also legitimately with civil society in questions of global governance. This purpose-focused approach has 4 categories: knowledge and or capacity building, problem-driven advocacy, end-user group representation, and coordination entities. So we found that while there are a number of diverse actors present, they are geographically and thematically dominated by a handful of key actor types. It also showed that many individuals were self-identifying as civil society, but they were actually representative of other stakeholder groups. You could find different governmental bodies and a specific technical community who self-identified as civil society. So simply focusing on the numbers of participants at IGF who self-identify as civil society can therefore provide possibly a misleading characteristic role of the potential influence that can be allocated to the stakeholder group. By unpacking this group, we wanted to show a more representative view of civil society participation in IGS, which provides nuance to the discussions on civil society participation in the multi-stakeholder exercise. The typology also revealed that there's a wide range of desired objectives and goals to be achieved by those who attend the IGS. While this is probably not very surprising to most of you who have already participated at the IGF, the fact is, however, that the data analysis shows that problem-driven advocacy groups, coordination bodies, knowledge capacity building organizations, and end-user groups are represented as one homogeneous body of civil society, and this may lead to confusion over the possibilities for concrete and measurable outputs to emerge from an IGF+. So overall, our study has shown that there is a hidden wealth available in the statistics of the IGF that can inform our policymaking capacity in terms of topics, representation, but also providing access, ensuring outreach to specific communities. And we must ensure that we are reaching out and looking at these accordingly. Thank you so much for your time. And if you have any questions, Jamal and I are very happy to answer these.
Thank you, Nadia. And now we'll go to Ricardo, who looks at the role of China in standard making.
Thank you, Roxana. So thanks again to the editor-in-chief and the editors of the special issue, and congrats again to everyone for featuring in this special issue. So yes, as Roxana anticipated, my article explores the role and influence of Chinese stakeholders in internet standards making. So from 3G, in mobile internet, of course, from 3G to 5G, with a main focus on the work of the third generation partnership project, so the so-called 3GPP. Now, through a qualitative analysis that entailed 28 semi-structured expert interviews with Chinese and Western representatives of 6 stakeholder communities, I tried to reconstruct and gauge the kind of influence that Chinese actors carry in 3GPP and their role in transforming or adapting to existing norms. The 6 stakeholder groups are involved were governments, international organizations, businesses, civil society, academia, and technologists. I'm particularly keen on identifying technologists as a separate stakeholder group. Because yes, it's true, technologists most often work for companies, so there is an overlap. However, at the same time, they have an expertise and a privileged view on everyday work of 3GPP, and not only on 3GPP, but also in other bodies such as the IETF, that policymakers and policy experts don't have. And so when we do policy analysis or geopolitical, the analysis of geopolitical implications of these things, without taking into consideration the role and views of technologists, we miss something out. And in interviews, they came up with qualitatively different views on the same questions compared to policymakers and policy experts. Now, coming to the results of my research, it turns out that the more Chinese stakeholders became powerful, the more they became participatory and showed acceptance of the existing rules and norms of 3GPP. What do I mean by this? I mean that when it came to 3G, for example, China was very marginal in 3GPP. It fostered the development of a domestic 3G standard, although domestic is quite a wrong term because anyway it was recognized by the ITU, and also it was developed in conjunction between domestic companies and foreign ones, especially Western ones, such as Ericsson is one of them, and they still hold patents on this technology. But then there's been a convergence in standards, and now we see that Chinese stakeholders are among the main actors in 3GPP. We know Huawei in particular is particularly influential. It possesses quite a high number of patents. It's been quite high up in the ranking of 5G standardization proposal, along with Ericsson, Samsung, and these kind of actors. And so there's been a convergence in standard, much more interoperability. And so we see Chinese actors participating more and more in 3GPP according to the existing rules. And we see that this is also because the more companies grow powerful, the more they need their patents to be incorporated in the global standard. It's a matter of scalability of the final technology. Because of course it's much easier for Huawei to, for example, to have to benefit from scale economies if it doesn't have to produce different devices for different markets following different standards, for example. So we see that overall Chinese actors, sorry for the background noise, that's from the road. We see that overall Chinese actors have accepted existing rules, adapted to existing rules, accepted that it was in a way, allowing the term, easier to become influential by following existing rules and procedures and work in the existing standardization venues rather than drifting the existing model and replacing it anew. And this, of course, has implications not only in 3GPP, but also for analysis in all the standard making body for scalable technologies. I've already mentioned the IETF. And of course, because I'm an international relations scholar, I'm interested in the future of the global order. And because I believe that these forms of private-based governance are a tenet, a form of the liberal order, especially with free market pillar. This also has implications on the future of the liberal order and its capacity to incorporate growing powers within the existing system. And this is all from me. Hope I stood within the time. Thank you, Roxana. I'm very open to questions now.
Thank you very much. And we will take questions in a bit. We have a final presentation now from Blaine and from Clara on the democratic legitimacy in global platform governance.
Thank you, Roxana, to you and all the editors for having our paper and for organizing this today. I'm going to start this very quickly and then hand it over to Blaine. So our paper, it builds on the great work that has already been published, trying to find governance and regulation proposals for digital platforms. Many of these works also focused or at least struggled with the question of legitimacy, as in what would be the legitimate way to try and find a way to order a digital environment that conditions the behavior of billions of users. And we realized that these talks of legitimacy were based on different things. So there were a lot of calls for human rights-based proposals. There are also people saying that they should focus more on user participation or on procedural principles of the rule of law. So our article tries to roughly organize this literature and mostly to argue that we should definitely focus on democratic legitimacy when evaluating proposals, but in a holistic way, meaning that when we focus on only one of these aspects, we end up falling short, since democratic legitimacy is more complex and encompasses more elements than these approaches consider. So given the global scope of these platforms and of these proposals, we looked to the EU democratic legitimacy literature for inspiration. We acknowledge that regulation of and by such a supranational body is not exactly the same as of and by global platforms, but we do think this effort of legitimizing norm making outside of the state proved to be very helpful for our goals. So Blaine?
Sure. Thanks, and good morning, everyone from beautiful Canada. Within the European Union democratic legitimacy literature, we particularly drew on the work of Vivian Schmidt. And in doing so, we basically adapted her kind of three-pronged framework for thinking about democratic legitimacy. On the one hand, you've got input legitimacy, which is what we're used to in terms of democratic accountability. Process legitimacy, things like transparency. Does the process actually work efficiently? Do decisions that are getting made get input from various stakeholders? And then finally, output legitimacy. Do outcomes fit with the values and norms of the population or polities in question? And we also highlight the interaction effects amongst these three prongs. Two key interaction effects in particular. Strong output legitimacy, for instance, can make up for weak input legitimacy and vice versa. However, strong process legitimacy does not tend to have much of an effect on either input or output legitimacy, while weak process legitimacy can actually tank legitimacy built up in these other areas. And the reason for this, as Schmidt explains, is that the people expect governments to do their job well, so they don't reward when it actually happens, but they will punish them if it's done badly. And so this would really be a warning about proposals, and there's a lot out there that put all their eggs in the transparency basket, for instance. We then evaluate 4 paradigmatic cases according to these criteria. We have the Facebook Oversight Board as an example of self-regulation, judicial adjudication as our second one, human rights-centric frameworks, proposal by David Kay, and finally the UK Online Harms White Paper, now turned into a proposed legislation, as an example of state-based regulation. And of course, we don't have time to go into our explicit findings on each, but we'd be happy to discuss them in the Q&A. But that said, our framework highlights that analysts and academics have spent a lot of time thinking about throughput legitimacy, in particular transparency, which in many ways is the least robust read of democratic legitimacy. And we spent too little time thinking about the power dynamics and how decisions get made, neglecting the reality that in situations where there is no universal optimal outcome because people can't decide on what counts as the best kind of speech rules in a given situation, in such situations, the key question is who gets to make the decision and to whom are they accountable? And we would argue that this approach is useful because it highlights, for those of us who are concerned about democracy, that the democratic nation state remains the only real conduit for democratic regulation of platforms. And also, on the other hand, that not enough attention is being given to democratizing non-state regulatory efforts. It also highlights, I think, what's been given up in the Russian some quarters to bless self-regulation experiments like the Facebook Oversight Board as people who want to have at least something done in this area. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. And with this, we end the series of presentations. I hope it became clear with insights from the research that went into the special issue that the framework of norm entrepreneurship in internet governance helps us understand a little bit better the new ordering of the internet, whether in implicit or explicit forms. The new research agenda of Normfare allows us to examine the drivers, the constraints, and the mechanism behind normative change in internet governance. For a long time, the norm entrepreneurship scholarship was very much focused on new ideas, new actors, new institutions, and it very much perceived the norm creation in an institutional void. But we are showing that the process of normative restructuring happens also in more solidified systems, like the ecosystem of internet governance, in a space where we have overlapping institutions, regimes, pre-existing norms that have been present for some time. So with a special issue, I believe we succeed in adding some granularity to the processes of contestation and constant search for normative changes and normative behavior. On this note, I'd like to open the floor for discussion and give everyone a chance to ask their questions and add their comments. You can take the floor. There is a raise hand function, but also if you just indicate on the screen like this, I think we'll be able to see you. Anybody would like to start? Eric, yes?
Excuse me. So very nice presentations and nice overview. I'm just a little bit curious of the term normfare that you coined, the sort of ideas behind it in terms of, say, linguistics or so. I'm thinking of a bus fare or train fare, and the sort of association you wanted to create, the alternative of, I understand that the intent is to depict a kind of sort of evolution or ride or sort of change, perhaps, in the norm development and the number of interests and forces that are impacting norms and norm development. But I'm just a little bit curious for how, if there were any specific reasoning behind coining this term. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And we do have the right person here with us to answer that question. I'll redirect the question to Matthias.
Hi, thanks again. Thanks so much also to the great contributions. And how have you managed to be so much on time? That's obviously Roxana's firm but gentle hand. So I think we came up with the term normfare together in our editorial sandbox. We felt that it was an interesting play on this idea of lawfare that has been popularized in the US discourse, but with a twist, not so much focusing on law and the rule of law, but rather on the many different normative approaches we see present in internet governance, at least on 3 levels, namely on the level of international law, on the level of national legislation, and importantly, on the level of transnational regulatory arrangements of different characters, from standards to interface attributes to dark patterns. We all see these as part of a larger normative order of the internet, and by pointing the attention of readers to that admittedly novel term, we feel that we're introducing a new twist to the debate on how to normatively frame our common future, and also the research endeavors. I hope this helps answer some of the points you raised.
Yes, you mentioned here lawfare. Did you have also in mind warfare as well, or were there more allusions in in your term? I find it very interesting.
Well, I mean, as Robert points out, the fair is from medieval England and English, and before that from Latin fatio, to do something with, right? So we do something with those norms, right? It's not bus fair, but war fair and law fair. So we well, perhaps in a way, I mean, you don't get me started on Latin, but since we mentioned warfare, there's a Latin saying, si vis pacem para bellum, right? If you want peace, prepare for war. In a certain way, we are also preparing for something through those norms, right? So we are conducting norm fair. We are conducting an exercise in curtailing the powers through norms. And that's at core what norm fair is about, right? We're curtailing state powers and platform power, and trying to make the internet governance field just a tiny bit more rule of law like. And if we've managed to succeed in that, then I think we can rest on our laurels for one day at least. Thanks.
Yeah, I think you provided a very good explanation. I also had in mind, yeah, the warfare connection, and we could argue that the search for new norms that would change the behavior of certain actors in this space is a very assiduous one, and it's very similar to preparations for war. Matthias, you also had the hand up. I think you've put your hand up before answering this question. Did you have a comment or a question?
I just thought, without monopolizing the debates, I would be very interested in asking, around what you think of the term. Did you think that it's a good addition, or do you think it's just just another term that you have to now think about? Is there added value to norm fair?
I see Nanette, yeah.
Just very quickly, when I first read the preface, it resonated with me because what I thought of, and this is quite interesting, it's like a Rorschach test, you're looking at that framing, that vocabulary, I immediately thought about contestation of ideas, contestation of norms, norms proffered by various groups, nation states, cultures, etc. So that's what came to mind, and I found it very powerful in that respect.
Thank you. Are there any other reflections on this in the room? Yeah, Jamal?
Hey, just to continue the play on words. So we have warfare, but we also have thoroughfares, at least in British English. I don't know if that translates, but a thoroughfare is a kind of a main road or something like this. And I always thought about this play of normfare as being something between the contestation and the kind of the ideal main route through. So that's why it's such a nice term for me, because it allows us to blend these ideas together in some way. And now I can delete what I was writing in the chat.
Thank you very much. I see no other hand up, but I do have a question for you. You've all worked on policy-oriented questions in your research. So I'm wondering if you are following up on the processes that you are researching for these articles. Where do you see your research right now, and whether there are additional actions we could take together to bring the knowledge from your articles closer to these policymakers? Jamal?
But maybe somebody else should go first.
Yeah, Ricardo, if you want to go first.
Thank you. Yes, I am following up on my work mainly because it comes from my PhD project, so it's still ongoing. And yeah, I think in the policy world, there is a general confusion So first of all, there's a conflation of 5G with the internet. I mean, 5G has a lot to do with the internet, but it's not the internet. And it's completely different architecture, etc. You know it better than me. But anyway, this is one thing. And there's a lot of discussion of, oh, because we have this trade war between the US and China, all the sanctions, some places will choose Chinese companies, some places will choose Western companies. So there will be internet fragmentation, but will there actually, there's a convergence in standards? What we see, if anything, is a market fragmentation. So what I can see that could be useful in the policy world would be a process of unpacking of all these aspects. Of course, standards and market are strongly connected because standards affect the market, but they're not quite the same thing. And also, this could probably be useful for the internet governance community more in general, because some groups seem readier to accept that studies on 5G and broadband and mobile internet standards, etc., are part of the study of internet governance, while some others prefer more conservative definition that leaves them out. Both are legitimate for different reasons. I'm not here to argue about that, but because the development of 5G is raising so many also technical issues on the future development, for example, of TCP/IP, I think it should fit more broadly within the research agenda. Thank you.
Thanks for pointing to the confusion that exists in the policy world. And I think we're seeing this with many other topics, not only when it comes to more technical subjects. We are seeing it also around fake news. We're seeing it also around artificial intelligence. Jamal, you also had a reflection on this?
Yeah, but only if now I'm talking with my Nadia and Trisha hat on as well. That's okay. So, and I just wanted to say that, well, the work that we've been doing in our contribution to the special issue was, yes, as Nadia pointed out, trying to kind of unpack what the notion of civil society is at the IGF, and this is also thinking about, you know, what's coming next with the IGF Plus, and so we hope that we'll be able to continue to do this. Also thinking in more detail about the mobility. So, you know, we now have this big data set that we've been using to break down civil society participation in the IGFs from 2006 to 2019. And what we want to do is now look at the mobility of civil society members across. Do the same people move across civil society? Do they represent different parts of civil society? Do they move to become parts of different stakeholder groups, and so on and so forth, and think in these terms? So the base work that we did for this article, we're hoping that it will provide in some way a contribution to the debates on IGF Plus, or at least understanding what civil society means in future IGFs. And then on the other hand, the database that we're creating will help us understand in more detail, more granular detail, what does civil society actually do at the IGFs and how are they represented. Yeah.
Thank you. Is there anything we could do to bring the research closer to policymakers? Any ideas would be welcome. And I refer to us as the community of researchers that are close to policymakers, but also as GigaNet, the Global Internet Governance Academic Network. One of the first steps in this direction will be to make more articles easily available in open access. So in addition to those that are already available on the website, because we were able to get the funding to cover the costs, we will also try to publish the preprint on our website or link to where they have been published elsewhere, so that people can find easily the research. But any other ideas? I see Nanette has a hand up. Yeah.
just very quickly, I think the research, at least on policymakers in the US, would be very important to look at policymakers in all countries, how they get and access information. And what we have learned, but a lot of this research was done not as recently as we would like, so it may have changed with social media, but how do policymakers actually access the information? And unfortunately, we have found that they do not necessarily go to publications. So in the dialogue, I suggested a dialogue or some kind of bringing together to share ideas orally, because you also have to build trust. And again, I think it's true, trust is true for every nation, but that's just a quick thought.
Thank you, Blaine.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some room for greater kind of interactions with policymakers. Just to use the example of Canada, we're years behind, definitely Europe and a lot of the rest of the world in terms of platform governance and internet governance discussions, and it's just exploded here in the past few months. And one of the things that kind of struck me about it's still kind of the issue of norms and whose norms are dominating is still very raw. It's very kind of almost a kind of a first generation internet freedom discussion, with, in some cases, any kind of democratic government regulation equated with authoritarianism. So I think that the issues that are being discussed in this article, in this issue, are really important, and that that at least in this case, the academic community, or this academic community, is far ahead of a lot of the policy discussion, at least in Canada.
Indeed. Corinne.
Hi, thank you. I mean, one of the things that I wanted to bring up is the inverse of the argument that was just made, which is that the academic community can be a little bit out of touch with what is relevant. And also, I mean, the fact that we assume that it's reasonable for policymakers to read these incredibly long papers, given that I'm married to one, it's just not going to happen given their other obligations. So I think one of the things that we need to think about is, how can we creatively engage policymakers without expecting them to act like academics? And one of the things that I found really useful is I co-chair a group of public interest technologists, called the Public Interest Technology Group, which brings together public interest technologists with policymakers, with academics, and with others. And once a month, we discuss the biggest things we see going on in internet infrastructure. We also have a mailing list. We write a weekly sort of overview for journalists to sort of give them a sense of what are the biggest things that have happened when it comes to internet infrastructure, to really try and make sure that we present knowledge in different ways and present it in ways that are more parsable to people whose job it is not to full-time read up or keep up with the academic literature. And I think a lot can be done within the academic community in terms of looking for these kind of solutions that make sure that the work that we do does end up with the people who make decisions.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Thanks, Corinne. And we might think of working with the Public Interest Working Group on this. I see that we are almost running out of time. Are there any final remarks or comments from any of the authors or the editors before we close this session? Eric?
Well, I just wanted to emphasize again that I really look forward to a continuation of this partnership, and for more special issues coming out of this grouping. It's really interesting, and also I like the interdisciplinary nature of these papers, and I'm curious to see further explorations in the terminology of normfare, and also to see how that is sort of theoretically embedded in some perspective, maybe related to SDS or ANT, or I'm not really sure, but fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Chelsea, did I see your hand up? Or was that, no, okay. Then I think we will close on time and I will end the recording very soon. I just wanted to thank everyone once more for this very inspiring presentations and a possibility to make new connections between these papers that for sure appealed to me because I read them in one way, but now when you presented them, I was quite intrigued by some other connections that could be made. So I look forward to staying in touch and potentially thinking of other ways to bring this research closer to policymakers, apart from the activities that we already discussed. So I'm hoping we can do this ahead of the next Internet Governance Forum, or maybe we find some space there to talk about what you have achieved with this research. So thank you once more, and congratulations for getting published in Telecommunications Policy. And thank you once more for the great collaborative work and the many hours you have spent on this, and for all the deliverables that got here on time. We greatly appreciated that on the editorial team side. This has been a great discussion. I would like to close here and just wish you all a very nice end of the day. Goodbye, everyone.